Today is May 31st, 2014, and this is episode 114. This program is intended for informational and educational purposes only. Cryptocurrency is a new field of study. Consult your local futurist, lawyer, and investment advisor before making any decisions whatsoever for yourself. Welcome to Let's Talk Bitcoin, a twice-weekly show about the ideas, people, and projects building the digital economy and the future of money. My name is Adam B. Levine, and today we've comped your airfare and saved you a seat right up front at the Amsterdam Bitcoin Conference. Patrick Byrne, CEO of Overstock.com and the Scourge of Wall Street, has become a big name in the Bitcoin space. The majority of today's show is occupied by his keynote, where he relates the experience and opportunity of cryptocurrency and his long battle with the masters of the universe.
I went to NASDAQ, the SEC, the Senate Banking, the House Financial Services, and the New York Financial Press, trying to alert them and explain to them there's systemic risk being created by this. We could explain this, had all this data, we got nowhere. And I found it was just turtles all the way down.
But first, longtime core developer Gavin Andreessen's State of Bitcoin talk isn't quite as long, but it's important. He talks the past, present, future of the first and largest cryptocurrency, Bitcoin. On an unrelated note, if you've been following my work on early user-created assets, I'm happy to announce the first to launch will be Tatiana Coin on June 3rd. If you're interested in learning about this project and the user-created asset process, don't miss episode 18 of John Bush's Sovereign BTC coming out tomorrow on the LTB network. Ladies and gentlemen, Gavin Andreessen.
Hi everybody, thanks for being here. I'm really excited about being in the Netherlands, being here in this beautiful place, and I'm really excited that it's not raining. I'm going to be talking today about the state of Bitcoin. And I think the first thing to say about it is that we are still all early adopters. I know people think about Bitcoin as this thing that's been around for a while. And, you think about the really early Bitcoiners who got involved with it just a couple years ago. But really, we are at the beginning of something that's just getting bigger and bigger. There's a question of, we're early adopters, but what are we adopting? Are we adopting a Laserdisc? I don't know if any of you remember those huge Laserdiscs that were supposed to revolutionize the way we use movies or watch movies. Or is this the beginning of the internet, right? This is Yahoo in 1997, I think, right? This was state-of-the-art internet. I tend to think that we really are at the internet, beginnings of the internet, that, Bitcoin as a protocol and Bitcoin as a platform is what it's all about. I want to get one thing out of the way at the beginning of this talk. I just hope that we can forget that February ever happened. There are all sorts of bad things that happened with Bitcoin in February that I think are part of growing pains. And any new technology is going to have growing pains. Bitcoin has certainly had growing pains in the past, and I expect it will continue to have growing pains in the future. And the one thing I think that's really surprised me about Bitcoin is just how resilient it has been. I think if you'd asked me 2 years ago if what used to be the world's largest Bitcoin exchange suddenly went bankrupt and disappeared, would Bitcoin be able to survive something like that? I might have said no. But it turns out we can survive, we have survived, we're moving on. And I think that just goes to show you that all of us early adopters really want Bitcoin to succeed, and we're all working towards making it succeed. I'll get into the meat of this stuff, right? This is kind of what I do in the State of Bitcoin addresses, is what's going on with the Bitcoin Core project. When I say Bitcoin Core, I mean the code that Satoshi left to us, the original code that he wrote that bootstrapped the Bitcoin network, and that still most of the core network is running. So I recently stepped back from the lead developer role. Vladimir has taken over as the core maintainer. We're taking the core maintainer title from the Linux project, where they don't say somebody's the lead, they're just kind of the lead organizer. I've been asked a lot about why I did that, and it's really part of a progression, right? I first heard about Bitcoin in May of 2010, and I got a lot of hats put on my head. So, at one point I was a Bitcoin Talk forum moderator. I was also one of the people who I used my personal PC to back up the Bitcoin Talk forum machine so that if it ever got down, we'd have a backup of all the conversations. I used to run the Bitcoin Press mailing list, so if any press inquiries came in, it would actually hit my inbox. As time goes on and Bitcoin gets bigger, I just start taking off all of these hats. It's like if anybody's worked at a startup, you know that when a startup has 4 people, those people are doing all sorts of things. And just as the project gets bigger, it makes sense to specialize and have different people do different things. So I'm going to be spending a lot more time talking to academics. I'm going to be spending a lot more time kind of thinking about where Bitcoin should be 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, a year, 8 months, a year from now, and less time worrying about, should we accept this pull request to Bitcoin Core. Part of that growing up is more resources. I'm happy to announce that Corey Fields has joined, is being paid by the Bitcoin Foundation to work on Bitcoin Core full time. So Corey Fields has done a lot of great cross-platform work. He's going to continue to do that. The first thing he's going to do is one thing that takes something off of my plate, which is actually make the Mac builds deterministic so that it's not actually me compiling the OS X release on this old laptop I have that happens to be running OS X 10.6 so that, we have compatible releases. Corey's cleaning all that up and doing it in a way that, there's not one central point of failure for that. The general idea with Core is still slow and steady progress. The number one job is still going to be making sure that the core Bitcoin network processes transactions as reliably as possible. So don't expect, huge, wild changes to Core just because I'm no longer lead developer and Vladimir is now taking on that role. There are a couple core changes that you should probably be aware of. Part of what we've been doing over the last year or so is trying to modularize the code more. Satoshi gave us a little bit of a hairball, this code that was Windows only way back when, that was a wallet, that was, the consensus code, that was the peer-to-peer network. It was everything all bundled up together. And slowly over time, we're kind of teasing apart the different pieces of functionality. Again, because as you grow, you want to specialize. So, for example, the most recent implementation of the core daemon, you can compile it without any wallet functionality at all to save a little bit of memory. If you just want your Bitcoin D to be an edge router. We'll be continuing that with stripping out more features. Probably the core consensus code is going to turn into a library, and we may even drop some features. So like right now, if you're using the accounts feature of Bitcoin D, beware, it may go away in the next year or so. I put this slide in here, boring is good, because I think there are some things that we've done really well that are really important that don't get talked about a lot. So, for example, we have a process for improving Bitcoin, the BIP process, and that seems to be working really well. I'm really happy to see people other than the really hardcore core developers participating in the BIP process. We've seen BIPs for wallet implementations, and we're seeing BIPs in other pieces of functionality. I think that's actually working really well and is mostly drama-free. The core release process is actually working pretty well. I think not a lot of people know that we have a pretty innovative way of actually building the binaries that you download. So the binaries are actually compiled on multiple people's virtual machines in such a way that they're bit for bit identical, and we can be darn sure that the source code that you see on GitHub actually does correspond to the binaries that you're downloading. There's kind of a security chain all the way down that I think we've got working really well. Download security, we have a lot of belt and suspenders around this. So like the downloads recently moved from SourceForge, where they weren't secured by HTTPS, to bitcoincore.org, which does have a SSL certificate which protects the downloads. They're protected again in that they're all, at least on Windows and OS X, they're code signed. So, once you run them, you can be sure that you're actually running the code that was signed off on. That's another kind of drama-free part of the whole process, that we could have a lot of drama there, right? But you really don't hear about people trying to fool people to download imposter versions of the core code. It just doesn't happen. And finally, the P2P network has been pretty darn stable, which is fantastic. So, that seems to be working pretty well. I don't know, Mike would probably quibble with that about denial of service attacks, but they seem to be under control. I want to talk a little bit about communication, because as we scale up, this is actually a really big problem. What are the places where people can talk about changes to Bitcoin? What are the processes? I said the BIP process works pretty well. It does work pretty well. Like larger changes to Bitcoin, there's not a good forum for like having these discussions. And I really want somebody kind of solve the internet troll problem. I don't know, maybe there is no solution, but it's hard to find a constructive place to, talk about potential changes without people, for whatever reason, kind of attacking people for talking, attacking people for thinking about ideas. I don't know. Like I said, I want somebody to solve this problem for us. Beyond core, what's happening in the Bitcoin world, technically, I've said before, and is absolutely, walking around the conference here, it's absolutely true. This is the year of the multi-signature wallet. So we're going to see some really exciting innovation happening with wallet security, with, wallets controlled by multiple people for corporations. I think there's a lot of innovation happening here, which is fantastic. Privacy is improving. So projects like Dark Wallet are happening that take existing, functionality that's in Bitcoin already and in increasing people's privacy by kind of leveraging things like CoinJoin and other ideas we have for making privacy better. Hardware wallets are something that really excites me. There's another way of getting a more secure way for people to hold their Bitcoins. I think it remains to be seen whether, will your phone be your wallet, or will you have a separate device, or maybe will you have both? I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. It'll probably be different in different markets and different people. Other full implementations of the Bitcoin protocol are maturing, and I think that's fantastic. And I want to go into that a little bit more in depth. So when I think about other implementations, one true implementation is okay, but it's kind of sort of evil, right? I mean, just one piece of code is not the ideal place you want to be. Because if, whoever's controlling that one true implementation is evil, then bad things happen, like Middle Earth is destroyed. Two is probably even worse than one, because you run into consensus failures. So if half the network is running one and half of the network is running the other, and there's some disagreement between them, which happened last year with, the 0.7 release, that's bad, right? You get a consensus failure, and Bitcoin is all about consensus. So ideally, we want 3 or more, where if anyone fails, it's okay. You have 2 or 3 or 4 or 11 others that, continue to work, and then it's obvious which is correct, right? The majority is correct. The question is, how do we get from where we are today, which is we have this one piece of code that is the consensus, to, multiple implementations, all of which are implementing the same protocol, and then, we can evolve the protocol by having all those implementations move along. And that's a hard problem. I think we're just going to have to struggle through it, but I think we can get there. I'll talk a little bit about mining. I'll say overall, I still don't care about mining. At the very first Bitcoin State of Bitcoin address, I think I got myself in a little bit of trouble saying I don't care about mining. And that's still kind of true. I mean, mining is a zero-sum game, right? There's a certain number of Bitcoins created over time. I don't really care who gets those Bitcoins from kind of a, high-level technical point of view. It doesn't really matter, right? If one miner is more efficient than another, they'll get more Bitcoins. Okie dokie, right? That's fine. I do care about kind of mining in the way that it affects users' experiences. And so one thing I've been really concerned about is the size of the number of transactions that miners put in their blocks. So we've had a lot of discussion about the 1 megabyte block size. I'm worried about even getting up to 1 megabyte, right? Right now, I think the average block size is about 250 kilobytes. We recently changed the reference implementation to build bigger blocks by default. We haven't yet seen block sizes rise. And so it's a little bit of a mystery why. Why are miners choosing, apparently, to build smaller blocks? I think it's because larger blocks take longer to propagate around the network, and miners are very concerned about orphan blocks where, they lose thousands of dollars if their blocks aren't accepted by the network. And so I think there is a technical work that needs to be done to optimize the communication of blocks across the network. So I'm thinking a lot about that. Once we get to 1 megabyte, we got to make blocks bigger. I think we just have to. If we don't, transaction fees will just rise and rise and rise to a point where only rich people can afford to transact on the Bitcoin network. And I personally don't want to see that. I think that's a bad world to be in. How is going to be the tricky bit. So it's going to be hard to get consensus on exactly how far we should raise the block size, if we should have rules for increasing the block size in the future. I'll be thinking and talking a lot about that. I think multiple solutions are possible. So there's some ideas out there of, well, maybe we don't increase the block size. Maybe we decrease the 10-minute per block, make that smaller, and then we could have more blocks that are all 1 megabyte and, increase transaction volume that way. I think these are all discussions we need to have. I think we should all keep in mind that I like simpler. I think simpler is better, but also that, multiple solutions may be possible. And if we can do more than one, then fantastic. We should embrace things and not fool ourselves into thinking that there has to be one true answer. I'll talk about mining ASICs because I think a lot of people are worried about ASICs. And the way I really do see the whole mining ASIC hardware thing is, being like the old cell phones that only rich people could afford. And I think tomorrow it will be more like cell phones today where, even babies can afford to get cell phones. And I think the whole, who is mining is going to go in waves. I think, we're in a centralization period where we're seeing huge mining farms in places where electricity is cheap. I could definitely see that turning around to where, you get a USB miner and plug it into your computer just because, you can make a tiny little bit of money, and maybe you're more efficient because you don't need to worry about cooling the damn thing. But we'll see. I don't know. I may be wrong. I get asked a lot about, what about Mastercoin, Counterparty, Made Safe, Ethereum, all these things either built on top of Bitcoin or that are being touted as Bitcoin 2.0. And I think they're interesting, but writing secure code is really hard. And there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem in that you don't know if your code is secure until it's securing something that's actually valuable. Now, we went through this with Bitcoin, and I basically have seen it. So, Satoshi released Bitcoin in January of 2009, and it was completely worthless, and nobody knew if it was secure or not. And we didn't find out it was not secure. And it turned out Bitcoin, the very first version of Bitcoin was horribly insecure. We didn't find out that it was insecure until Bitcoin started to get a value. And it became interesting to attack. And so you have this chicken and egg problem, I think, with any new project in that you're not going to know if it really is secure until it has some value, but you really don't want to promise things and have people invest money in it, if it is insecure. So that's going to be the first hurdle. And some of these systems probably will bootstrap past that. And, if the incentives are correct, and, there's an incentive for everybody using these systems to make them better, then I think they could possibly bootstrap just like Bitcoin did. The other hard bit that I think a lot of these projects are ignoring is identity and reputation is really hard. You can talk about things like, distributed autonomous corporations and, smart contracts. And for me, thinking about it from a high level perspective, usually it comes down to, do I have to trust somebody or some piece of code? Yeah, I'm okay with trusting a piece of code. I trust Bitcoin because I can read the code and understand it. But, like some of these systems, when I think about, well, you're going to write this really complicated contract, and then how do I actually have to read the code to know that's going to be doing what I think it's going to do, or do I trust the person who issued the contract? And if I'm trusting the person who issued the contract, well then, why bother with some complicated piece of code? I could just trust them to begin with. So I think cryptography doesn't really help this problem. I mean, you can create a cryptographic identity and maybe you can build some trust up around that. I think with some of the dark marketplaces, we've seen kind of how far that can go, in that, nothing's stopping somebody from building up something with a lot of reputation that's very valuable and then deciding, okay, there's enough value there, I'm just going to take it and walk away and betray all that trust that I built up. So that's a really hard problem. And then becoming mainstream is really hard. I mean, certainly Bitcoin's not there. And you can have really cool technology. Like, I think Segways are really cool. I'm tempted to go down and rent one at the Segway place here. But they're not mainstream, right? I mean, you don't see people zipping around on Segways. I don't think you ever will. I don't know if you remember when Segway was being hyped and coming out, and the vision really was that we'd all be zipping around on these Segways, and they would replace cars and all sorts of other crazy predictions. But it really is hard to become mainstream, and that doesn't mean that you're a complete and utter failure, right? There is a place you can rent Segways downstairs here to zip around. I don't think anybody would have predicted that would be like policemen and tourists would be the two main markets for the Segway scooter. And a lot of these Bitcoin 2.0 projects, I think we might find the same thing. It's some odd, weird little niche market that maybe they take off in that we don't expect. That'll be fun to watch. I'm going to end by just talking about where I think Bitcoin will be next year. If I do a state of the Bitcoin next year, what do I think? I think Bitcoin will be bigger and better looking. I really do mean it will be better looking. I think the wallets will be nicer. I think, user interfaces will be polished. I think it'll be, much more secure. I think multi-signature will go a long way for that. I think it will be more diverse. I'm hoping that by this time next year, we will actually have, other implementations of the core consensus code that people are comfortable running. I think it will be more mainstream. We are going mainstream. When I see Bitcoin comic strips show up in my local newspaper, and my kids come to me and say, "Hey, Dad, did you see Bitcoin in Dilbert?" I mean, that's cool. That is going mainstream. I think we will be more regulated. I don't think Bitcoin itself will be regulated, but all of the infrastructure on top of it, I think we will see more regulation. I just think that's inevitable. I think that happens with any technology. I'm hoping it will be less volatile. I hope the price will calm down. That may be a false hope. That's probably the one that I'm least confident of, because I just don't know what will happen in the next year. Anyway, thanks a lot. I think we might have time for one or two questions. Thanks.
I have a question regarding the mining fee, and really I think that it's frustrating to see there's so much confusion about it. As I see it, it's essentially just proportional to the latency in the network and the reward. So when the reward goes down, the fee will go down as well. But not a direct function of the block size that you hard code into the client. It's not really related to anything there. And we had some discussion on the Devil forum about that. So I think it's something we should kind of spread this word.
Okay, I mean, I see transaction fees as being being pure supply and demand, right? So there's a limited supply of block space. Maybe we should talk offline. You can convince me that I'm wrong. It is possible to convince me that I'm wrong. I think anybody who's worked with me knows that that's true.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. My question would be, you talked about regulation and that it might increase next year. So I think there's to some degree also a problem with anonymity or pseudonymity within the core Bitcoin wallet as it is right now. And my question would be, what do you think of these efforts like Dark Wallet to increase anonymity? Like, I don't know, the dark coin or whatever is coming out right now. So will the Bitcoin core development team also work on these kind of solutions to maybe make regulation more difficult, or will you try to be more regulatory friendly in this way?
I think we will be more regulated, but also more private. I mean, as for the question of core, we're splitting out most of the wallet code into ideally kind of a separate project. And I would imagine that, once that is done, then teams will arise to implement CoinJoin, implement some of the other privacy enhancing techniques that, ideas that are out there. So I think that will happen, and I think that's fine. And you asked specifically, what do I think of projects like Dark Wallet? I think it's fantastic. I think more privacy is better. And I don't see, if you talk to regulators, right, there are regulators concerned about consumer privacy and consumer protection. And there's another set of regulators that's concerned about law enforcement and investigation. And, they'll have different opinions on whether technology is good or bad. On a high level, it doesn't really matter because, technology is what it is. And, regulations evolve, and the software will evolve.
So Gavin, increasing the block size is going to be a hard fork change probably. If you ask any Bitcoin Core developer what hard fork changes they would like, you'll get a list a mile long. Do you see a possibility of working on, say, a select small subset that people can get consensus on in preparation for a future hard fork?
Yeah, I think that will be part of the conversation. There are bugs that we should just clean up, right? And whether we should do that as part of a hard fork or not, we could talk about. I have my own pet peeve bug list of things that I would love to change in a hard fork. I think there is a danger of doing too many things at once, because obviously, do too many things at once and you have an increased risk that there's some awful bug in one of them that causes the whole network to fall down. So we'll just have to be very careful about it. I think that's all the time we have, but thanks a lot. You can, I'll be at the conference all day today, all day tomorrow. Thank you.
CryptoKit is the world's first Chrome browser Bitcoin wallet. It's the easiest, fastest Bitcoin wallet payment system. With a simple one-click install, it takes just seconds to get your wallet set up. And because CryptoKit finds the address and payment for you, there's no more fussing around or tab switching. CryptoKit is more than just a wallet. It comes with a preloaded PGP encrypted social network, news feeds from Reddit and Google, and up-to-date charts from exchanges. Finally, CryptoKit Directory allows you to make two-click payments with any of the BitPay merchants. Once you install CryptoKit, you won't need anything else. For more information or to download CryptoKit, visit CryptoKit.com.
Hi, listener. Here at Let's Talk Bitcoin, we're building a global network of correspondents able to contribute on-the-ground perspective when cryptocurrency-related information comes across their filters. If you'd like to join our global conversation, send an email with your name and geographic or cultural niche to apply@letstalkbitcoin.com. Just like Bitcoin, the only barrier to entry is your time and good work. Thanks for listening.
Our keynote speaker today is a liberal in the classical tradition. He considers himself to be from the Austrian School of Economics and a leader in exposing Wall Street corruption. He has triple degrees from Dartmouth, Cambridge University, and Stanford University. As CEO of Overstock.com, he took the company from $1 million in revenue to over $1.3 billion in revenue. He is a true pioneer, and he made history in the Bitcoin world when Overstock became the first major online retailer to accept Bitcoin. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to take this opportunity right now to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Patrick Byrne.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John, for that overly generous introduction. Members of the Bitcoin Foundation board, ladies and gentlemen, cryptographers, computer scientists, finance geeks, quants, Austrian economics theorists. I think there's maybe a couple gangsters in the room, journalists who are trying to make sense of it all. It is a surreal honor to be invited to speak with you today, both because of who you are and because this is taking place in Holland, in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, I should say. And I would be remiss if I did not take a moment to acknowledge a debt that historians generally overlook in my country, the United States, and in other Commonwealth countries, a debt owed to Holland. To the Netherlands. And that is the creation myth, so to speak, in the United States, is that we had these founding fathers, the Constitution was written, Declaration of Independence. Those who know something know that our founding fathers read a lot of an English philosopher named John Locke, who was a social contract theorist, wrote a book called Two Treatises on Government. And maybe we know that there were these people, the pilgrims, who came to our country with some notions of religious toleration and such. So we see the intellectual history of our country as coming from these two sources. What is generally overlooked in this story is the enormous contribution our hosts, the Dutch, made to that process. And it's a story that's generally overlooked, but I'll be touching on it later. So first, I want to thank them for hosting this. And I'll tell you just for a moment, I'll spend a moment about who I am. You may, a few months ago, Wired did a large story about me. And I'll just point out, they called me in this the Bitcoin Messiah. Just to be clear, I'm not the Messiah of anything. And as much as I favor Bitcoin, or I love Bitcoin, I'm about the crypto revolution. I'm about the cryptocurrency and other missions for this technology. I'll also mention that, or point out, I was called the Scourge of Wall Street. I could spend hours telling you how this came about, but I just want to tell you I'm going to give you one amuse-bouche out of a decade-long story, and that is, but just to give you an idea of who you're listening to, maybe you don't want to listen, in January 2007, a very well-known and actually a well-regarded hedge fund manager in New York, kind of an elder statesman of the industry and not himself a bad guy, and a fellow I had known at a distance for some years, asked me to come see him. And I went to sit with him, and there was a witness there, and this has all been actually vetted by this journalist. This is all true. This very well-known hedge fund guy sat me down, big guy, and his opening words were, "Patrick, you need to know you are the most hated man I've ever known in my entire life. You used to be kind of a golden boy here on Wall Street, but now you could kill people and you wouldn't be hated like we hate you in this town." So, of course, to me, and I assume to you, that's high praise. I mean, they can carve on my tombstone that in January 2007, I was the most hated man on Wall Street. And how I got that way actually ties in rather a deep way to what brings me here today. I should apologize now if this talk isn't what you were expecting. If you're expecting a guy to get up and talk about blockchains and stuff, I'm not the guy. I want to talk about the historical context in which I see the Bitcoin revolution and the cryptocurrency revolution. Alas for you, I can't really do that without talking a lot about history. So if you didn't expect to come to a lecture this morning that included a lot on history and philosophy, I hope you can get your money back, but that's what I've brought. I'm going to start with discussion of two books that invite us to view civilizations as operating systems. One, probably known to many people here, is Snow Crash. Now, Snow Crash is kind of a cyberpunk Bible. It came out about 92, 91. And for one thing, it's known for being really quite visionary about the direction the internet would develop, with what they call the metaverse, but what we came to know as the World Wide Web, even Facebook, the idea of distributed republic. This is kind of the Bible for anarcho-capitalists, if there are any of those here. Memes, actually, the concept of a meme actually comes out of this book, and many other things. But the real value of this book, it invites us to view civilization as operating system. You know, nobody gets all excited. There's Unix and DOS and Windows and Mac and Linux, and nobody kills each other about which is the right operating system. It's all just, there are other virtues than truth when you're talking about an operating system. Well, he invites us to view history the same way, that this is really that Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, East Asian Confucianism, these are operating systems, and history is an enormous petri dish where these different organisms are in a Darwinian struggle to figure out what the best operating system is. And taking that a step further, a book that came out just a couple years later by Francis Fukuyama, Trust. Now, Fukuyama wrote another famous book called The End of History. He's kind of the last Hegelian of the 20th century. But his point of trust his point in this is that you can view different cultures and civilizations as operating systems to solve one central problem. And that problem is, how far does trust extend in a society? If you're in a low trust society, family-based society, China, Taiwan, Italy, his argument is that you don't trust people outside the family, which means that you don't get businesses bigger than something that a family, maybe a large family, can run. And that means that you're limited, you give up economies of scale, was his argument, as opposed to high trust institution-based societies where you can trust outside of your family, you can trust institutions, you can trust things like the government, you can trust shareholder corporations and all this plumbing and mechanism that underlies the modern world. And because you have that trust in a high trust society, you get efficiencies of scale, you get et cetera, et cetera. That's his argument. I'll be circling back to that. So now, history. George Orwell said that you could imagine the future as a boot stepping on a human face over and over forever. I don't think that's true, and I don't think that's going to be true because of folks like you. But thinking of that as an operating system, that was, in fact, the family of operating systems throughout all of history till about 500 years ago were more or less some variation of that operating system. Then something really odd happened 500 years ago here in Spain. And of course, the Europeans among you do not need to be reminded. Once 500 years ago, Europe was a sea of Spain with an island of France in it. But this was Spain. And in these northern provinces, well, this was part of the Spanish territory, as was England, or the co-monarchs, Ferdinand II. Whenever I see Game of Thrones and I see Joffrey, I think of Ferdinand II. This strange idea started developing in the north, and it was a collection of ideas, generally philosophers called liberalism. The basic common DNA of them all was that the consent of the governed mattered. And started off in two places in the Spanish Empire. One was here in the Netherlands, where ideas like tolerance, pluralism, constitutional federation of free states, and peace emerged. And it's hard to imagine, like some scientists prove somehow that fish don't know that they swim in water. I don't know how you prove that, but they don't know that they swim in water. We live in the modern world, and it's hard to remember what the world looked like before these ideas came along, but this was not at all intuitive to people. Erasmus, the great Catholic theologian, the University at Rotterdam is named after. He introduced these concepts like religious toleration, political toleration, and pacifism. Baruch Spinoza, the great one, from right here. And if you have time here, you should visit the National Museum and learn a bit about them. But Spinoza came up with the idea of the self, the modern idea of the self, as an agent from whom consent mattered, and who was capable of consent that mattered in a political system. Maybe these ideas emerged here of tolerance and pluralism and constitutionally protected freedom emerged here perhaps because of the middle class, the merchants. Should mention that also generally historians consider a large factor is the expulsion of Jewish people from Spain and Portugal. And they came here, the best ones, well, Portuguese ones came here. In fact, in the synagogue here in town, which I also suggest you visit, they spoke Portuguese into the 20th century because it had such an influence. If you were a Marxist, you might also say windmills. The invention of windmills here gave this society a great deal of cheap, abundant energy, gave it a huge competitive advantage over everybody else. And everything else I just mentioned is this ideological superstructure that came with this economic development, technological development. But these ideas emerged here. And interestingly, a group of separatists, that would be English Protestants who didn't believe they could reconcile with the Church of England, they came here. They came here at the beginning of the 1600s, and they lived here for about 2 decades in Leiden. They finally got fed up. They actually loved it here, and they learned learned these values. They learned that a society modeled on these kind of principles could work. They were discouraged, though, quite literally, by the effect on their young that was had by Amsterdam. The licentious and wicked ways of Amsterdam was corrupting their young. And so they picked up and they sailed to North America, where we know them as the Pilgrims. But they actually, and we give all this credit, we think of England as the cradle of liberty, but in fact, it was all conceived here. Also, John Locke, whom I mentioned, who had such an effect on our founding fathers, he came here sitting out some of the English Civil War, spent 3 years here, went back and wrote this famous book, Two Treatises of Government, that became sort of the founding inspiration for the U.S. Revolution and much that came after, at least in the British Commonwealth. So that's why I say these ideas owe such a profound debt to this country. The cause of freedom, U.S. Constitution. That's one side. The other thing that was going on in Spain about 400 years ago, very interesting, at the University of Salamanca, a group of scholastic Jesuit and Dominican friars became the first economists. And they discovered notions that were kind of lost and not rediscovered for 300 years. But things like the subjectivist theory of value, which we now equate with Marshall and the Cambridge School of Economics, 1880s, that was actually first developed by Jesuit and by the scholastics in Salamanca. Impossibility of socialist calculation, which is again a main theme of the second half of 20th century economics. Quantity theory of money, the equivalence of cash deposits and demand deposits. In other words, why fractional reserve banking isn't a good idea. The value of entrepreneurship, value of property and contract, and again, an anti-imperial platform that was quite critical of the days of Spanish imperialism from within Spain. Well, something funny happened to this school. These thoughts bounced through Spain, Italy, to the eastern edge of the Spanish Empire at the time, the eastern edge, the eastern reign, the Österreich, i.e. Austria. And they went into hibernation for about 250 years. And about 150 years ago, they came out of hibernation in the form of the Austrian School of Economics. And those who I met here last night and this morning who think of themselves, they say, as Austrian school guys, it actually all didn't start on Austria. It started here. Well, it started in Salamanca. And I consider these two this generally the heart of liberalism, of liberal political philosophy, of pro freedom. I like to call this way of thinking. Now, people always object. Well, sometimes people object to me, maybe not in this crowd. You can't hijack the word freedom. You can't say you're pro-freedom, other people aren't. Well, there are people among us in our society who call themselves progressives. And if they hijack the word progress, I think I can hijack the word freedom. This to be understood in opposition to the great philosophical mistake. And this all circles back in one more slide, I promise. It circles right back into Bitcoin and what you're doing. But I need to describe this great philosophical mistake, basically a virus that was introduced into the operating system of liberalism. It was introduced, and it's authoritarianism, and if the key element of the DNA of liberalism is consent to the governed, for authoritarianism, it's submission. The great enemy of mankind, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, introduced it. His book, his version of the social contract, written really in answer to Locke, makes this very extraordinary claim that, so finally the control freaks knew that they had lost. The Enlightenment come and they had lost their grip on history. So they subverted it with this idea that, okay, it is consent that matters. It is the consent of the governed, but not in this silly way that John Locke understood it. We, intellectual French, understand it in a much deeper way. I, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, understand that there is something that he terms la volonté générale, the general will of the people. And that is important. That is what matters, but it's not to be determined by silly voting or something. That in fact, there may only be one person among us in a nation who understands what the real will of our people is, what the real will of the nation is. And that person, as the sovereign, has no need to give no guarantee to its subjects, no constraints. There need be no constraints on it. His will is or should be nothing but the law. This Robespierre, when he forces everyone to obey his will, it just looks like tyranny, said Rousseau, but it isn't tyranny because he's forcing people to be free. And true freedom is found in submission to this force that understands the general will, that understands the real historical mission of our nation, of a nation. And that's true freedom. Well, this was, Voltaire read this and wrote a famous response to Rousseau where he said, I've received, sir, your new book against the human race, and thank you for it. One longs in reading your book to walk on all fours. I love Voltaire. Bertrand Russell was once asked, did he have a Bible? And he said, yes, I keep it over there under my Voltaire. So Voltaire was correct, but unfortunately he didn't win the day. This became a really dominant strain in modern political philosophy, starting with Rousseau, led to Kant, who, Kant was a pietist working away in Königsberg, famously never left the city. In his bare pietist study, he had one adornment, a portrait of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And in his Teutonic way, he worked out the implications of this theory in this, grand and Teutonic way, develops the idea of ein Volk, the mission of a people. And that freedom is found in subordination to this mission, that's true freedom, not the freedom that the phenomenal self looks in, which is just what you or I want to do, the pursuit of happiness, life life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness is how Locke put it. That's just this sort of superficial form of freedom. The true freedom is understanding the historical process you're part of, and through submission to that. Hegel comes along. I never got anything out of Hegel other than late stage Kant, and some Prussian stuff. Marx, who takes Hegel and says famously, I'm going to take Hegel and turn him over and stand him on his feet, meaning he's going to take all the dialectic of Hegel, but apply it to economics. And this is the real historical process that matters, that mankind has a story. It has chapters, and the final chapter is the ultimate triumph of the proletariat and such. And freedom, again, is defined as submission to that process or commitment to that process. So it's a very different definition of freedom that had emerged in Holland, England, Scotland, and then the Americas. Nietzsche, who reads like he's an individualist, cares about the individual. He doesn't care about the individual. He's all about the Zarathustra, the individual in a capital I kind of way. And Nietzsche famously dismissed this whole other tradition, saying only an Englishman cares about happiness. That's his answer to John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham and the utilitarians and John Locke, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He says only an Englishman cares about happiness. In other words, Nietzsche, I understand the real historical mission and where freedom is to be located, again, in some sort of submission to that. Lenin, of course, for him, it's not the masses, it's the vanguard of the masses, the party, freedom. And I used to live in communist China, and I used to debate these kinds of things with intellectuals there who would actually maintain these points of view that what you think of as just bourgeois Western freedom, real freedom is submission to, in our case, the Communist Party. Of course, the Third Reich. Over the gates at Dachau and Auschwitz, the signs read, Arbeit macht frei. Work will make you free. Work for the German state. Work for the Reich. Again, this idea of submission, properly chosen submission, is where real freedom is found. Mao, again, I lived in China in the early 80s under Deng Xiaoping and used to have these conversations. And I was in Cambodia in the late 80s and speaking with French educated intellectuals. And it's amazing that in these kind of places, everybody knows their Rousseau. Everybody knows Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, the Marxist canon, of course, but the three Western philosophers they always knew in these places were especially Rousseau. So that is, as Voltaire said, mankind walking about on all fours. This idea that this is how you define freedom. So the great corruption occurred from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So going back to this issue of trust, where does that leave us? Well, the vision that I think is fundamentally authoritarian, believes that we need central institutions. And it argues for centralized institutions in one form or another. It's uncomfortable with institutions that are not centralized. It all comes out of that authoritarian tradition. The problem, and it's funny, this fellow himself who wrote this is considered a conservative, Fukuyama, but he's arguing that you want high trust society. You want to live in a high trust society where you can have robust, centralized institutions, taking for granted, of course, that we can trust those institutions. What's neglected in his analysis is the whole problem of regulatory capture. And regulatory capture is an extraordinary field in itself. It was invented in 1972, a guy named Stigler, friend of Milton Friedman's. And he just noticed that, look, society sets up regulators to protect us from certain industries and certain forces. But sometimes those regulators have a tendency to get captured, to get owned by the industries it's supposed to be defending us from. There's a Marxist at Harvard named John Hanson who argues an even deeper theory he calls deep capture, which is that it isn't just the regulators get captured by the bad guys. It's regulators and congressmen and police and journalists and judges and academics. That the capture goes very deep. I started a website 8 years ago called Deep Capture that explores well, it's won various awards as the best site on corruption in the United States, best economic investigative journalism in the United States, stuff like this, where I explore the capture and corruption of our centralized institutions. The great problem comes down to, if I'm right, and that there is more capture occurring than is sort of generally recognized, what happens is what John Kenneth Galbraith called the bezel. He spoke of the bezel. And the bezel is, in a modern society, if you could sort of freeze time and ask every single person, what's their stake in the financial system? What do you own? And you could add it all up, you get this much, but you look and there's only this much there. And the difference, and at any given time, there is this difference. And he calls that difference the bezel, which is the amount that has been embezzled from society, and none of you know it. And at any given time, there's the bezel that is growing at a fast rate or a slow rate. I became convinced about 10 years ago there was an enormous bezel in the financial system. And the two centralized institutions that I think are the sources of it, and I think 2008, a lot of different causes for 2008, but one of the causes is it was a manifest, some of this bezel bubbling to the surface. And the two centralized institutions that are to blame, central banking and central counterparty clearing. And both of these, central bank, the reason I'm so committed to Bitcoin and crypto is because crypto can solve the problem that both of these organizations are presenting to society. In the case of central banking, it follows, once you have fractional reserve banking, and fractional reserve banking was legalized in 1844, Robert Peel in the UK. By the way, there's a wonderful Spanish economist who writes about the Austrian school and central banking that people here maybe like. His name's Jesus Huerta de Soto, and he's written on the subject. But anyway, once you have fractional reserve banking, you're always going to have the elites who own the banks over-leveraging themselves. And they over-leverage themselves in one way or another. They go kaput. They need a bailout. They need a lender of last resort. Once you have a lender of last resort, you have somebody who thinks you have a central bank, and they think they can start directing and guiding and fine-tuning the economy, the tinkerers. There's a fellow at London School of Economics who says their vision is the economy is an enormous engine, and they're like a workman with a screwdriver, and they think they can just fine-tune it and get it just right. And that's their vision. The problem with this way of viewing the world is we laugh at the Soviet Union, those of us old enough to remember it, for trying to run a country without prices, without real prices. They had 23 million prices being set by apparatchiks in a bureau in Moscow called Gazprom or something, that Gazplan, that they set 23 million prices, how much the screws cost that would go in this bracket, that would go in this bookshelf, 23 million prices for everything in society being set by apparatchiks. And we say, oh, how ridiculous. What a crazy way to try to run a country. But in our society, the most important price we face is the price at which we discount the future against the present, which is to say interest rates. And interest rates are being set, both in Europe and the United States, in central institutions called central banks with names like the Federal Reserve of the United States. We laugh at the Soviets for it, but we're doing it with the most important and fundamental price in our society. Central counterparty clearing. This sounds so dull, but it is, I think, an enormous opportunity for you cryptos here, for Bitcoin or some Bitcoin-like technology to emerge. This is what I'm talking about. There's when you watch a movie, You're not conscious of the grips and the gaffers and the lighting guys and such. You watch the movie. When you trade in the stock market, it's the same thing. You just assume underneath it all, there's some plumbing that makes everything work. So when you buy 100 shares of IBM, it's getting your account, so forth. Well, we went public in 2002, our company. And when you're a public company CEO, you're out there in the mix. I'm out there with hedge fund guys, prime brokers, banks, all these kind of people. And by 2004, I quickly became aware there was a bunch of criminality going on. Didn't take a lot of genius. I was asked to take part in it. By 2004, I had it pretty well mapped out. I know just who was doing it, the network of hedge funds. There was a network of about 15 hedge funds in America centered on a guy named Stephen Cohen that were at the center of a huge stock manipulation scheme, which included insider trading. I started talking about it publicly and naming them by name, as I just did, and I promise no one will ever sue me because none of these guys can take discovery. And incidentally, Cohen later, this whole network came under investigation, became the target of the largest federal investigation of Wall Street in history. 80-odd people have been sent to jail. Cohen himself just paid $1.8 billion fine, and it's the tip of the iceberg. I think the criminality goes far deeper than anything you yet imagine, even in this audience, on Wall Street. But the real thing that was going on that I got arguably a bit obsessed with is the whole question of clearing and settlement. You assume that there are that plumbing underlying the financial system making everything work. And let me promise you, so I got into this very deeply. It's way too arcane to go into here unless I get the right questions. But there's far more slop in the systems that underlie the transfer of property and title in our society than you would possibly think exists unless you were part of it. Let me repeat that. The systems by which property rights and title get transferred have gotten lots and lots. I thought I was getting yanked off. Of slop. There's some academic reasons for it that they thought it was okay. There's more fault that basically property rights have gotten digitized and securitized and hypothecated and rehypothecated and netted and pre-netted and sliced, diced, and circumcised. And the systems lose track of who owns what. And so I was making some very public criticism of this, 05, 06, 07. I was dismissed as a nut. When 08 happened, first thing the SEC did went and plugged several of the loopholes that I was talking about. But there's much more there. For example, the mortgage-backed security crisis, the American Banking Association estimated in 2009 that of the mortgage-backed securities, which is when somebody takes, like Goldman Sachs would take 1,000 mortgages, package them into a bond and sell that they were, in general, the American Banking Association said 18 to 30% of the mortgages that were stuffing the mortgage-backed securities didn't exist. What was happening was people were somebody was getting Lehman Brothers or Morgan or somebody was getting ready to issue a bond. They had expected to have 1,000. Only the paperwork had been done on 750 of them. They would just go ahead and issue the mortgage-backed security anyway and replace the missing 250 with some basically IOUs with the intent of replacing them later. But everything got so far behind in the whole mortgage-backed security industry before the crisis that when everything Chernobyled, the ABA said that 18 to 30% of this stuff was just kind of phantom. It didn't really, that's how much slop there was in that system of chains of title. People didn't know who owned what. Now, I think this has all gotten, Secretary Geithner famously, privately made this awful comment about we need to foam the runway for the big banks. In other words, that's what the U.S. Treasury's done. They foamed the runway. They made it up. They made it so the banks could fill in all these potholes, of course, at the expense of the taxpayer. But the examples, you may have heard of the MF Global scandal, a large company that melted down, $2 billion was missing. Those $2 billion of securities had been hypothecated and rehypothecated to London for some tax arbitrage, and then when it melted down, no one could tell who owned what. That is going on, and that's the essence of why I got 10 years ago so superfly TNT about Wall Street, because Wall Street was doing this openly. You didn't have to scratch too hard to find out where it was going on and how much it was going on. And they were saying, well, it's okay. It's okay because of efficient market hypothesis and stuff. Everything comes out in the wash. It's not okay. They're wrong. They turned out to be wrong. So that brings me to the answer, to the problem. The problem is if crypto is the answer, what's the question? And I'll close on this. What system respects the consent of its participants while undermining the centralized institutions we've come to distrust? To me, it's the technology that's being built here by people like you, which I see as the fruition of this 500-year-old effort that started right here in Amsterdam. So, thank you for your attendance. Hope you have a good conference. I'd love to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. I feel like I have an honorary degree in philosophy just by listening and attending. So I could listen to philosophy all day long.
Good.
Bitcoin audiences are famous for asking great questions. So we have people with microphones that are in the back if you want to ask any questions. I want to start and ask a question of my own, though, after listening to your presentation. I was wondering if you could explain for us and for the audience here, how did your business change at Overstock when you started accepting Bitcoin? Give us an idea of like what, in a day-to-day way, what changed? What were some of the things that you experienced through customer support questions? Did you get new media attention, for instance?
Yes. Well, this story is worth telling. On December 19th, a journalist called me and said, in a long interview on other subjects, mentioned, do you think you'll take Bitcoin? And I'd been keeping an eye on Bitcoin for a few years. By the way, I did my doctorate in philosophy, but along the way I studied computation theory at Stanford and Gödel and the math that underlies crypto. And so when Bitcoin first came along, it sparked an interest. I recognized it as being based on the stuff I had studied 25 years earlier. So I had this affection for it. I was waiting to see what the feds were going to do. They seemed to green light it around November, or at least they said they're not going to red light it. At December 19th, a journalist calls me and said, and in the space of an interview on other subjects, says, you're going to take Bitcoin. I said, well, maybe by the end of 2014. And I just said it off the top of my head. Well, that mention, I started seeing showing up in Korea and Japan, and these newspapers all over the world were reporting that I had said we might take Bitcoin. So I called Coinbase, just looked them up. They sent someone out. We had one or two conversations on the phone. They sent someone out. On January 2nd, they sent someone out. On January 9th, we were live. So we had a fantastic experience with Coinbase. I also happen to know BitPay. I hear the same kinds of story about BitPay, so I don't want to disrespect anybody here. But I know that those are both excellent organizations with great backers. And they got us live so quickly. And the truth is after we got it live, well, there were two phases. One was just getting it live, and the second phase, there's three phases. Getting it live, being able to issue returns when customers buy a podium and they return it, you want to give them their money back if they paid in Bitcoin and they want it back in Bitcoin. That was the second phase. And the third phase is having our international checkout process be able to accept Bitcoin. Well, we got the first phase live in a week. We got the second phase live a month or two ago, so we can now issue refunds in Bitcoin. I think we're still a month or so away from international orders being able to pay in Bitcoin, which of course distresses me. But so it was since we got it live, it's been so seamless, haven't had to give it a second thought. There's been no problem. I know I sound like a commercial, but it's required no work from any of us. We've had to retrain some customer service agents on now how to issue Bitcoin refunds, but it's just a few minor things like that. We have I think we're coming up on $2 million worth of sales, which is nice. We'll do $1.5 billion this year. I expect we'll do 10-ish in Bitcoin. And that's nice. It's growing steadily each month.
Did you get any new press from the branding?
Yes. Well, once we did it and once we went live, yes, as you may have, it became this, I couldn't believe the amount of, I could not believe, it paid for itself, the implementation 100 times over just by the press. And I really want to express my gratitude to the Bitcoin community. What apparently happened was, as I hoped would happen, the early adopters out there, the Bitcoin users, started coming to our site and just as a show of support and buying a set of pillows or buying a bed. And we sold, a few 100,000 just in the first 2 days after getting live, just people wanted to show their support.
Excellent. Okay, let's see if we have any questions in the audience. We'll start here. Do we have the microphone?
So if Bitcoin does undermine these central institutions you're talking about, what's the best possible scenario? What does your rosy picture of the future look like?
Well, my rosy picture of the future would be that the bezel gets squeezed out of society like the toothpaste out of a tube of toothpaste. That is slowly and steadily, with no major dislocations, everything gets filled in. That would be my rosy picture. My guess is it's hard to imagine this technology is so disruptive. It's hard to imagine it doesn't disrupt something deep along the way. But it couldn't happen to a nicer set of people. I know that it would be bad if it happens, but anything's better than the system, at least in the United States, the system of knuckleheads. We basically live in an oligarchy now in the United States. There's a wonderful economist, Simon Johnson, was the chief economist of the IMF, now he's a professor at MIT, and he has said publicly, look, what I used to deal with at the IMF, going to Argentina or Russia or Indonesia and sitting across from some young, bold leader, and it's always a new, young, bold leader, these oligarchies always get themselves, the elites leverage themselves up too much, they crack, and the government bails them out. Then the IMF comes in and the government wants more money and they say, and we need to figure out, are you in Argentina, are you going to use this money to fix things? Or are you just going to keep on bailing out your elites? Well, I, Simon Johnson, says he, am telling you that's all that's happened in America, that you've become an oligarchy. I think the history of the United States can be told as a war between two factions, Wall Street and Washington. I can personally attest, having been on the front lines of this, and I knew this 10 years ago, long before it became common knowledge, Wall Street has Washington under its thumb. And to the extent I'm actually surprised that we all didn't get outlawed a few years ago by Washington. Obviously, Russia and China and other autocratic states are going to do it, but I'm surprised that Washington, maybe it just got away from them. But I think that their day is really going to be ruined. If Bitcoin or crypto takes off, if we start seeing cryptographic ways of transferring securities, and I know there are people here like Next working on that, there's other organizations working on taking this technology and applying it to capital markets, not just currency, but capital markets. Because I believe the bezel is so enormous and is so much worse a problem than is generally understood, I think that this kind of alternative technology is going to have a more dramatic effect than is generally understood because people don't recognize how big a problem is there.
My name is David Orban, and I believe that what you said is very true regarding the distributed systems that are substituting centralized systems. And crypto is just one component in this. Energy produced by solar is distributed, 3D printing and manufacturing, food production, health, learning, all are part of the same process. And the nation state is being undermined by this. But the nation state is also reacting as an immune system trying to protect itself. So you seem to be an optimistic revolutionary, but revolutions are always started by optimists and then they become bloody.
Bolsheviks take over.
and what comes out of it at the end is impossible to control. The well-being of billions of people is at stake here.
What's the question?
What can we do concretely to stop policymakers from making it bloody and taking over the revolution?
Well, I think you've analyzed it right. And listen, I have so many scars from I sat there in the halls. The answer is nothing. I think the answer is you're not going to do anything to stop. You're not going to get anything to make government make the right choice. Let me tell you, in 04, 05, I had concrete data, proof. I had people involved. I had hoodlums from Staten Island, another Dutch name, Staten Island, who were going and willing to talk to, the SEC with me, to NASDAQ, and explain what was going on, and to the Senate Banking Committee and the House Financial Services and financial journalists in New York. I'm reminded of another Bertrand Russell story. Bertrand Russell was once famously, he was in India, and he was lecturing on Einstein's relativity, and a Hindu cosmologist stood up in the back of the audience and said, "Professor Russell, you have it wrong. The universe rides on the back of a turtle." And Russell said to the Hindu professor, "Well, what's the turtle ride on?" And the guy says, "The back of another turtle." And Russell says, "Okay, what's that turtle ride on?" The fellow says, "I'm sorry, Professor Russell, it's turtles all the way down." Well, listen, we had clear proof that there were these flaws in the settlement system, that there were brokers wildly misrepresenting. Basically, it was fractional reserve banking without a reserve requirement. We had participants, we had data, we had economists. We went to NASDAQ, we went to the SEC. I was warned, if you keep pushing this, Byrne, you're going to become the target of a federal investigation. I said, you got to be kidding me. This isn't some schmuck country. You don't get. I pushed it. I became the target of 6 federal investigations over 10 years, all of which went nowhere, all of which cost millions of dollars, fought. They gave up, they dropped, they give me a letter saying they were wrong, and 3 months later, they start another investigation. And we later used Freedom of Information Act requests to find out that there were Wall Street. Anyway, I digress. I went to NASDAQ, the SEC, the Senate Banking, the House Financial Services, and the New York Financial Press, trying to alert them and explain to them there's systemic risk being created by this. There's latent derivative risk that people don't understand is there, because when you have unsettled trades, it's like a contract, it's like a type of derivative called a contract for difference, but one with this pernicious circular effect. We could explain this, had all this data, we got nowhere. And I found it was just turtles all the way down. It's turtles, all the establishment that you think is overseeing these centralized institutions. In the US, it's called the DTCC. And expecting them to be doing their job. They're not doing this. And listen, I'm reporting from the front line. I spent 04 to 08 in this battle, and millions, it became my hobby. This is how I became the Scourge of Wall Street, trying to expose this stuff. So I could give you some happy talk that says, if there's this disruption, this is what you can do to convince the governments. You can't. The governments they don't care, or they don't understand. The people you're up against, you got to remember, the people you're up against all have senators on speed dial. And I mean, I faced this myself. I used to go in and talk to senators, and they would say, and I would explain everything, and I would bring economists to explain stuff, and I would finish. The aide to the senator would tell me on the way out, what you say makes sense, but every time you're here, Goldman Sachs is here 10 times, telling them not to listen to you. So I think I could give you some happy talk saying you're going to make a difference with the government. You're not. I think the one thing that happened to our benefit is this got away. It got away from them. I don't think it's normally aggravating how slow the U.S. federal government can be to see something and understand it and respond. But for once it helped our side, because this came along, and I think that if really everybody had been on their game, they would have stopped Bitcoin 2 years ago. It's gotten away from them. It's too late now. I don't think they can, but I don't think there's anything you're going to be able to do to bring this in for a soft landing. If the system is really at its core as corrupt as I believe it is, then as Bitcoin gets adopted, it will cause severe dislocations. I think what you're doing, though, is creating a robust parallel system to which people can quickly switch. And I think that's really about all you can do.
Do we have another question?
Thanks for the great speech. I think as a Bitcoin user, of course, you expect a stable currency, and Bitcoin is fluctuating very much. It's pretty volatile for the moment. And I'm from China, and I see in China, Chinese government has not been very supportive for the digital currency, and the trading volume is very big in China. And my question is, how do you see the fluctuation rate of digital currency in the future, and how do you think the government policy is going to affecting digital currency and your business? Thank you very much.
同志，这个问题特别聪明啊，谢谢。对我来说 ，well, for I'd say that first, I know that China, well, I thought they outlawed it, although I keep seeing these indications that it's not really outlawed. I don't quite understand. The fluctuation risk, there's a saying on Wall Street, liquidity begets liquidity. Once you start having liquid enough exchanges, it will there's network effects. There's network effects that come to play, and more. The problem is you don't have a liquid enough market now, and that's why there is this volatility. It's hugely ironic that I'm the guy saying this, but anyway. We ourselves at Overstock don't expose ourselves to much of it. We trade out. We started off trading out instantly from 100% of our Bitcoin transactions. Then I felt that was kind of cheating, and I wanted to accumulate some Bitcoin. So now we accumulate about 10% of all the Bitcoin spent on our site. We're accumulating. But the fluctuation problem is a real problem for businesses. And I think it's also going to, I was just speaking with someone earlier today who said, well, when the price of Bitcoin comes down, fewer people come in and sign up for new wallets. And then when it goes up, more people come in and sign up for wallets. That may be, and I'm sure that's true, on balance, all the volatility is probably discouraging people. However, the only way we're going to get there is eventually enough early adopters adopt, and there starts being enough liquidity, and then the liquidity begets liquidity, and then things should start. You shouldn't have the kind of volatility you have now in Bitcoin. But Mike, I don't follow it like I probably should, but my understanding is the last couple months, the volatility is somewhat smoothed out. And I would imagine just as more people buy into it, that you'll see that'll happen more. And when somebody develops, I don't know if anyone developed yet, we would use it if it were a service, a way to hedge your Bitcoin risk. So you don't trade out of it so much as buy various puts and such. You buy forward contracts. But that's enough. I'm trying to indicate areas that would be good business for entrepreneurs to develop. One would be, and I know there are people working on it, Bitcoin version of a stock market. Another is a Bitcoin, a derivative market where a good derivative market where businesses could hedge through options out of their Bitcoin risk. Third, incidentally, is micropayments. I think that Bitcoin could solve. The publishing industry has been wrecked in the last 15 years. People want to charge subscriptions, or they want to charge for content, or they go to advertising-based models. There's very few publications who can really Am I singing your song here or something? Are you? Okay, there's very few publications that can really charge online subscriptions. But if what I imagine is a world where you go to a newspaper and it's, to read some article is 3 cents, everyone's going to pay 3 cents to read it. And if they did that, it could save the publishing industry. Anyway, I think those are the three areas that if I were interested in getting and starting another company, that's what I'd be doing. But the point is, as more participants come in, the volatility should smooth out.
Okay. We need a microphone up here, please. And then we have time for one more question. Right up here. I'm sorry. Can you stand up, please? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Brian Crane of Epicenter Bitcoin. So you talked a lot about dismantling of centralized organizations. Now, I'm curious, is there a role for, in some contexts, where centralized organizations are superior to decentralized systems? Or are you worried that, Overstock being a large centralized organization as well will be, dismantled and replaced by decentralized applications in the future?
Fair question. No, it's not that I'm against all centralized institutions. I think that there are efficiencies that come. Every corporation, by its nature, is kind of a top-down economy. There are problems when organizations get too big that are not subject to market pricing internally. But no, I'm not an anarchist like some of you. I think there's a role for government. I think there's a role for centralized institutions. But just as the left, when I was in academia, the left tended to be obsessed with the idea of market failure. Guys like Paul Krugman, Joseph Stiglitz, good guys. Well, Stiglitz is. They love exploring the ways markets can fail. And markets do have natural tendencies to fail. There are certain types of goods that are not best left to the market. But you always got to ask the question, compared to what? Governments have ways of failing too. There are certain standard ways that government choice fails. And one of them is through capture. And so in designing, by the way, I say this not as, I'm a small L liberty guy. I'm not right wing or left. But when people on the left talk about the need to have a robust, muscular government that can stand up to these powerful corporations like Goldman Sachs, they fail to consider the possibility that what happens when your muscular government becomes a wholly owned subsidiary of Goldman Sachs. Now you got the worst of both worlds. So I'm not against all centralized institutions. I just think in the design of institutions, we have to take more consideration of the risk of their capture. And all else being equal, you want peer-to-peer institutions where consent plays a role rather than submission. So thank you, John.
Thank you. Can you take one more question?
Sure.
Okay, I think
absolutely.
we have a question over here. Was there one more?
I'll stay here all day. But I know you got a schedule.
Hi, my name is John Lay. I'm really curious, when is Overstock going to move their shares over to the blockchain?
Funny you say that. I want to be, if I say this now, it's gonna get reported, and then 3 days from now, I'll have guys locked in a room eating pizza and making it happen. It's what I said to some journalists. We put 40 people in a room, slid pizzas under the door, they got it done in a week. Funny you say that. I want to be I would consider issuing a security just to get the first Bitcoin security or blockchain security out there. I'm also exploring the possibility, we're listed on NASDAQ, but can we be dual listed it's possible in the States, you can have stock dual listed on more than one exchange. You can list it, it's listed on NASDAQ, it's listed in Berlin, it's listed in the Bahamas exchange for, I don't know why, somebody went to not me, somebody out there in the Bahamas went to the trouble to get it done. I believe we could list on a blockchain kind of exchange. and I have some lawyers in the stages. They're talking to two different parties. And if anyone here has a technology or has a solution, call collect. But I would love to be, at the very least, to take our current NASDAQ traded security and dual list it. And I would also be interested, as I'm going to get excoriated by the lawyers, but in issuing a bond or something that we could list as be the first to list this kind of security. So call collect.
Good. I think
I noticed some people in their blogs, when I first came out and did this, some people said, this guy just did this stuff with Bitcoin for publicity. I'm hoping, if nothing else, this talk dispelled. You understand this is a deep part of my life, what you folks are doing.
And I think that's an excellent note to end on, so let's hear it again for Patrick Byrne. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Excellent time.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to episode 114 of Let's Talk Bitcoin. Content for this episode was provided by Gavin Andreessen, Patrick Byrne, and John Matonis. Music for this episode was provided by Jared Rubens. Any questions or comments? Email Adam at letstalkbitcoin.com. Have a good one.